Hi everyone, I'm Jack the Rambling Raconteur, and I hope that you're doing well. I want to talk about the last time that the New York Times tried to tell me what books to read, and what an enormous influence it exerted on my life for the next few years. This list I came across at around the age of 20 in college. And I still have the list. This video was, of course, stimulated by a different list. The one that was published across the past week of the 100 greatest books of the 21st century, as voted on by some 500 individuals, collected and then published by the New York Times, celebrated, complained about, the matter of discussion here on Instagram, at my dinner table with my wife as we tried to predict what the top 20 would be on Friday, and we nailed a number of those. We've read a number of those, rolling our eyes at other selections or smirking. But I thought about a different list. It was a list I discussed with my then friend, not even girlfriend at the time, just friend in college. And it was a list I'd come across while sitting, going down a Wikipedia wormhole one Saturday, working the front desk at Apache Santa Cruz Hall at the University of Arizona. And I was at an interesting time as a reader. I had really read an enormous amount of nonfiction from 7th or 8th grade up through about 10th grade. I read almost no fiction outside of genre fiction, like science fiction, during those years. I went through enormous quantities of nonfiction, though. And then in 11th, 12th grade, I started reading a lot of classics. And I mean 19th century literature, Shakespeare, really digging in. In college, I was assigned to read Blood Meridian by Cormac McCarthy. This volume will come up again. It's sort of like Chekhov's book for this video. And so I had read Blood Meridian, and I thought that was unlike anything I'd ever read. But I wasn't reading any contemporary literature. I had read, all of Fyodor Dostoevsky's major works by that point. I had read enormous amounts of Shakespeare by that point. I was reading and really studying the Greek tragedies. I had read Chaucer in Middle English. And so I was really just diving in to what I regard as classical literature. The 20th century books I read, the fiction, it was from the 1920s, 1930s. It was Ernest Hemingway, F. Scott Fitzgerald, Steinbeck. Honestly, Steinbeck's East of Eden was probably the most recently published contemporary general fiction novel I had encountered, other than being assigned Blood Meridian. And so I was reading crime fiction, and I really enjoyed No Country for Old Men. And I just really liked that. It was different from reading Faulkner or Hemingway. It had elements of them, but it was just a different book. And so I thought, I really liked this. I really liked, Blood Meridian was interesting. I didn't love it right away, but it was interesting. So maybe I'll read some more of this Cormac McCarthy guy. So over the winter break, I had read All the Pretty Horses, and I think No Country for Old Men may have been in theaters that previous November. And so I'm then reading The Crossing, and from that memory, I look at the Wikipedia article on Blood Meridian. I'm like, what did people really think of this? I know what my English professor thought of it. What did others think of it? And I come across a footnote in that Wikipedia article about some article in the New York Times about the best books from the past 25 years, with the great American novel from the past 25 years. And I think, okay, this might be worth a read. And I click on that. And it's a very boring day at this desk, because unlike most residence halls or dorms where the front desk is sort of at the center of the building, it's right there at the main entrance. Everybody comes through. It's a hub of, social activity. There's usually maybe like a little lounge or mini lounge nearby where people just hang out for hours talking and just coordinating, calling each other's rooms. This was before text messaging was super common, or right around time text messaging is becoming common. People would call each other's rooms to organize, like, we're going to go to dinner at the Union, are you in? Or we're going to University Drive, are you in? We're going to go play volleyball or basketball. This front desk I worked at was sort of like a guardhouse. The building was shaped like a U with a courtyard here, and then there were fences that came across the courtyard, and there was a separate small building. That was the front desk. That's where kids had to come if they got locked out. They had to leave the building and come to this other building where someone would be, and they had to then, they would come in and we would give them a key, or if they wanted to check out a vacuum cleaner or an ironing board or something, that's where they had to come. It was very weird. Nobody ever came by. And so I just had all the time in the world to sit and read and read and read and read. So I come across this article and I look at it and it says it's stimulated by a question: what is the single greatest work of American fiction from the past 25 years? And it's supposed to span 1980 to 2005. And I think, wait a second. I've been reading a lot, but I haven't been reading any contemporary literature. I couldn't tell you anybody's name outside of, honestly, at that point, Toni Morrison and Cormac McCarthy. Those were probably the only two general fiction writers I had read anything from in that time, who were writing in that time period. And there was one other novel I had read that I had really loved, and I saw it mentioned in this article. I thought, okay, wait a second. I grab my pen and I just start listing. And I check off a few of these that I've read, and I check off others over the years. But this list dominated my reading over the next few years. I would go out and acquire these books in used bookstores. I would spend time with them. I was reading them. Right through the end of college and the first year out of college. And it really just cast this enormous shadow over my reading life and shaped what am I enjoying about these books? What am I not enjoying? And it brought me to the realization that I didn't need lists to guide all of my reading. I didn't need this list or the Modern Library's list of the 100 books published by their, publishing consortium of the 20th century to be a deep reader or to enjoy reading or to understand what I was reading. I remember having conversations with my then friend and now wife about how I had not read Ulysses or King Lear or other works that were important, because I felt like I needed to read other works in order to get to those, that those were mountaintops I wasn't ready to go scale yet. I needed to practice with these other works and get up to that level before I embarked on reading Ulysses, embarked on reading King Lear and appreciating them. The irony of these conversations being that I would in fact read Ulysses sitting in airports and on flights to go visit her once we started dating after college, a couple years later. But this was just an enormous, massive signpost for me. I'm curious to know if anybody else encountered this, at whatever age you were. The list was published in 2006, but as I said, I came across it in 2008 while reading The Crossing. I had read All the Pretty Horses over winter break. I was reading The Crossing. I was enjoying it. I still really, really like this book. And so I thought, well, what did people think of Blood Meridian? And this became just a roadmap for my reading. So I want to talk about some of these books and sort of give you where they fell. I'll try to link the article in the description box, but thanks for hanging out. So number one was a book I had read, and that was Beloved by Toni Morrison. This, along with Blood Meridian, these were the two books I'd read where I thought, man, these are amazing. These are fantastic. These had sort of replaced Lonesome Dove by Larry McMurtry as what I thought a novel, like a contemporary novel, could be capable of. I had read this when I was 18. I had read this just a couple months later when I was in the middle of a massive William Faulkner binge, and I was realizing, wait a second, people are still writing books that are as powerful and as true. I think that was part of it. These books felt very true and real. And they were getting at something that people didn't want to talk about, that whether it was people my parents' age or my grandparents' age or my peers in college, people didn't want to talk about reality. They wanted a gloss on reality that was fiction, that fiction was this way to escape and enjoy these stories that made the reality a little more ideal, a little tighter perhaps than the world we actually inhabit. And these were books that didn't flinch away from that reality and say, no, this really happens. Violence happens. Slavery happened, and racism is happening. There are aspects to our world that are truly terrifying and horrifying, and if you just hide from them, you're kind of missing out on what is a very crucial aspect of our shared culture and our shared experience. And so I had read these, and I thought, well, maybe I'll take a look at the rest of this list. And so, of course, Underworld by Don DeLillo was on there. And this is not my favorite Don DeLillo novel. I've mentioned that in a whole video about where to start with Don DeLillo. But this was not my favorite novel of his. And it wasn't even the first one I read. I did feel like, wait a second, if I'm going to undertake Underworld, maybe I should read Libra first, or I should read some of his other books first. And so I later would find this in a used bookstore. It was like a half off the hardbacks already, they're basically doing clearance on hardbacks at this used bookstore. And so I picked this up for like $2. And it's an important book, but it's not necessarily the one that I go to and I think like, man, that one really changed me as a reader. It got me thinking. But the other two were readers that I think probably taught me the most from this list. And it was the idea of you don't need the list to be your end-all be-all guide. Pick what you want from it, read what you want from it, enjoy what you want from it. Because one of these was the writer who I think probably exerted the single most influence on my teachers in grade school and high school. And that's John Updike. And John Updike has not exerted the greatest influence on me as a reader, or certainly the same influence that he had exerted on the generation of my teachers. They had grown up reading Updike, reading his poems, his stories, his reviews, his novels that were coming out every other year. And this was somebody that people talked about when I was in school. And I remember my 8th grade grammar teacher telling us when we came across a poem in our textbook, you know, this anthology of poems and stories and such, and the novel in there was called Wild by Jack London. But one of the poems was by John Updike. And I remember our grammar teacher pausing and being like, John Updike is an author that your teacher has met. And we were like, whoa, Mr. Posthumous, street cred. I thought he was, you know, just an absolute clown. Like, who's this guy with the big nose? That's all I remember. I don't remember the poem. But A&P, for example, the short story A&P, which is a pretty good story, that was in one of my textbooks in high school. And so John Updike was somebody I read some of his stuff, and I thought, okay, wait, he's got novels. I've never read his novels. I got to read these. I did, and there are aspects of Updike's writing that have really stayed with me and that I do enjoy, and there are aspects of Updike's writing that has aged probably worse than anything else I'm going to show in this video. And it's weird because I think with Updike, I was reading him, and I remember having read some of these books before he passed away the following year. So he passed away about a year after I came across this article, this list, and I had embarked on reading Updike, and then he passed away right in the middle of this massive project I had unwittingly set for myself. And then learning weird details that he had psoriasis, which I have, that he was my height, and being like, oh wow, like there's this guy who's just like me, and who's writing these books about someone who I don't ever want to become. So there were the Rabbit books. And then there was Philip Roth. And Philip Roth dominated this list. In here, I can see, I had written the top 5, then I wrote everybody that got more than one vote. And I had some other books that were mentioned, some other books that were mentioned. But as I was going through, I just kind of grouped all the Philip Roth stuff together because it just seemed like there was so much. And I thought, oh gosh, like this guy got more votes than Toni Morrison. Like he must have really produced something if he's up there with you know, Toni Morrison, Cormac, McCarthy. And so I got to read his book American Pastoral, and I read it in a different edition, but then years later I came across all of these at a super discount rate. But American Pastoral and The Human Stain kind of came in for a mention, but American Pastoral was sort of the 5th book on the list, and it was like, you know, you got to pay attention to this. And Roth was someone who, because there were so many of his books on the list, I even wrote, you know, I don't think Zuckerman Bound is in the article. I thought it was, but when I reread the article, I don't think it was in there. I had just added Zuckerman Bound. I should probably read that too. That he just carpeted the list. And when I would read his books, if I didn't like one, I would think, well, he's written so many, I'm just going to try another one in a couple of weeks, and I'll see if I like that. And so as I looked back through my reading log, I was reading a Philip Roth novel roughly every other month for close to 2 years. I read a dozen of his books in like a 20-something month spate. And I really liked a few. I absolutely despised a couple of them. This is right around the time that Indignation and The Humbling are coming out. And neither of those were very good, but I was reading his other books. And so, as I said, I listed all the books that got more than 2 votes, and I realized, wait a second, I've got some of these down. Let me just, you know, make my way through these. If these are the big 5, I'm going to read all of these in the next year, and I absolutely did that. But what else should I be reading? Well, from these big 5 writers, there are a few other books. There was, of course, the Border Trilogy by Cormac McCarthy, and I had all the Pretty Horses I liked. It was not nearly as powerful, though, as, in my opinion, either No Country for Old Men or Blood Meridian. But The Crossing I loved. I thought, oh, this is right up there with these other two that I've liked. And so I dove into Cities of the Plain. And so I was really just a voracious reader of McCarthy. And then I encountered Outer Dark and realized, pump the brakes on that, pal. With Don DeLillo, as I said, I really wanted to read Underworld, but I felt like Libra would be a better fit, especially like the JFK conspiracy. And I've done a video on Libra. I've done the whole DeLillo video. This is still, I think, up there with Running Dog as two of my favorites. But White Noise was one I grabbed and dove into. Other books that were on that list, of course, there was just the reams of Philip Roth. So The Plot Against America, which came out when I was in high school, I believe. I think that came out when I didn't read it at the time, but I did read that later. I thought that was pretty good. The Counterlife, and then of course Operation Shylock, Sabbath Theater, and with Roth, one of the things I was realizing was how just varied his writing could be, and yet how unvaried his writing could be. Like there were the Zuckerman books, and then there were these books that kind of looked at how is the U.S. and U.S. culture and city life changing, and then there were books like Sabbath Theater that were just vile, squalid. And so I was just reading these. There were other books that I really did love. So Jesus' Son by Denis Johnson, and just really spending a lot of time, reading and rereading this book, reading his book Angels, which has a whole section in Arizona. Where I'm Calling From by Raymond Carver. I had read a number of his stories already. I'd never been assigned a Carver story, but I had enjoyed the film Shortcuts. So that was sort of my gateway into Carver. And so when I saw this on the list, I thought, wait a second. He was writing those in the 60s and 70s. Like, that's not contemporary. And they were like, well, it was published in the 1980s. So that's how it counts. And Confederacy of Dunces was on there for the same reason. I was a little suspect of that. I noticed the same thing on this recent list of works that were written decades earlier, but were translated into English and republished in English in the 2000s. So they count as 21st century books. I thought that was a little suspect, even back at the age of 20. But the things they carried by Tim O'Brien, it was interesting to see Housekeeping by Marilynne Robinson, knowing that Gilead is just a world, superior. Mating by Norman Rush was probably the worst book on the list. Winter's Tale by Mark Halperin is not great, though, I'll be honest. And then there was The Known World, and I thought this was interesting. I probably should have noted that this was the only other book on the list that was by an African-American writer. But that wasn't what I really grabbed on first with this book. I think part of what I grabbed on with The Known World was that Edward P. Jones seemed younger than just about all these other writers. Edward P. Jones seemed like someone who was closer to my parents' age, because everybody else was about the same age as my grandparents. Frankly, like a couple of these writers were born the same year as my grandparents. And so they were writing these novels in the 1980s and 1990s and early 2000s. But these were all people who shared experiences and cultural changes and global changes with my grandparents, not necessarily with me. That they inhabited a world that was at a remove, that was frankly closer to the world, I think, of John Steinbeck than my own world in some way. These books, as much as I wanted to be reading contemporary literature, these books, they seemed to be set at a remove. And in some ways, like with Beloved and Blood Meridian, I think that really worked. It worked that they were dealing with the 19th century from this perspective they have of the atomic age and post-Vietnam, post-Watergate, post-Civil Rights Act, and the sexual revolution in the 1960s. But in another way, that there was just this sense that these were books that were still having a register of authority and of majesty as I approached them. The Known World was different because it was also grappling with some of these same ideas of Beloved, but it was from a younger voice. It was from someone who felt closer maybe to my parents' age, or my older cousins who were like 9-10 years older than I am, to their sensibilities. And so I thought, this was something interesting now. This was different. This felt a little more contemporary. And what I had noticed on the list was like these where are these younger voices? And there was a paragraph about that, that there were basically almost no votes for, younger writers who were publishing in probably more the 1990s than the 1980s. And there was this little list, and so I duly wrote those down here. So it was the Amazing Adventures of Cavalier and Clay, which I think I truncated on my list. This is one of my wife's favorite novels by Michael Chabon. She was really happy to see this pop up on Friday, and I'm actually in the process of reading it because it's one of the few that don't have a check mark. I never read this book, but I'm excited to get into this one. It had mentioned that there were no votes for Infinite Jest. This is my wife's copy of Infinite Jest, and this is one that she has read. I've read other David Foster Wallace. I just finished The Broom in the System, but this was one that, that it was interesting to see the ways each of us had taken this list and run with it. She had pulled all the books by younger writers that got one vote and read those. I had read all the books that got a bunch of votes. It said there were no votes for Richard Powers or William T. Vollmann, or maybe one vote. And they didn't have books, but I wrote the Goldbug variations for Richard Powers and Europe Central for William T. Vollmann. I will say this, the ice shirt is a world above Europe Central. Goldbug variations is actually very good, and Powers is a solid writer. Fortress of Solitude by Jonathan Lethem. So I read those, but I also noticed, there was still some street cred on this list because Invisible Man had won some previous poll that had taken place from roughly 1940 to 1965, and Invisible Man by Ralph Ellison is a stone cold classic. This is a masterpiece. I thought, okay, wait a second, that other list this list is inspired by this other list that did come out with a winner, so I better read these big five at least, and maybe the rest. The Adventures of Augie March by Saul Bellow had been discussed. There was an aside about The Group by Mary McCarthy. But the last part of it was the 15-year gap. So the gap from 1965 to 1980, because books published then couldn't get any votes. They weren't eligible for the criteria on this list. But I had read one of the books that were mentioned. It said, the ones that were missing are probably some of these. And in that list was Ragtime by Il Doctore, which I'd read 2 years earlier and really liked. I loved this book. I thought, this is something cool. This is I want more books like this. And so when I saw that, I thought, okay, I've got to read the rest of these books that are mentioned in this paragraph here. And one of the very next ones I went to after, finishing The Crossing was Song of Solomon by Toni Morrison. And I loved it. I loved the book. I reread it a couple years ago. I still love this book. I thought on some level, I was like, this might be better than Beloved. Portnoy's Complaint by Philip Roth, which I did not love. I still don't really like. But then Humboldt's Gift by Saul Bellow. But then there were two others that sort of sent me a little deeper. And one was Gravity's Rainbow by Thomas Pynchon. And this was one of those books that everybody was talking about reading or claiming to read or lying about reading or reading the first page over and over and over. I read Against the Day, but I thought, maybe I should read this because that had come out, but I'll read Gravity's Rainbow too. It got me to read, Inherent Vice, which I did not like. It got my wife to read Inherent Vice as well, though, and I think Bleeding Edge. And then the last one, and this was a book that really, of all the books on the list, more even than, Philip Roth or finally joining my teachers and reading John Updike, the one that probably exerted the most influence, honestly, probably even more than reading Don DeLillo. Because I think I would have discovered DeLillo. He popped up in enough places. I think I would have discovered reading him at some point. I would not have ever read JR without that article. This is the one book from the article that I don't think I ever would have read up until NYRB Classics republished this in the recognitions. Other than that, there's no way I ever would have read JR. Nobody talked about this book. I had never heard of it. I had never heard of William Gaddis. I'd heard of William Gass, and I think I maybe conflated the two a little bit. But within a year of writing all these down, I came across this book, and I thought, okay, I came across it in a used bookstore. I picked it up. I opened it up. The introduction was kind of interesting. And then I got onto the first page and I thought, like, this is kind of wild. Like, it's just all dialogue. It seems like it's almost all dialogue. I've never encountered anything like this. This book was just amazing. And this really did send me to go, climb a few greater heights. Works like Ulysses and things like that. I love JR, and I'm glad so many others have joined me in loving JR with the NYRB Classics Review. But this is the one that I found this in a used bookstore, and I would read it after college while I was coaching track. I would read it on the bus. We had these hour-long bus rides out to track meets, and I would just sit and read JR a couple times a week. And if I was at the all-day Saturday track meet and I wasn't coaching, I had like 2 hours of downtime, I would just sit and read more JR. And that's how I made it through this book, and I really loved it. And I never would have encountered that book in my early 20s without this list. So let me know if there are similar experiences you've had as a reader. Like I said, these books really did shape me. I don't know how many of these I would have read without that article. I'll link it in the description box. And I also learned to take all of these lists with a grain of salt, whether it's the Modern Library list, Esquire's infamous 80 books to read as a man, the current list. I think it was maybe GQ put out a list of like 21st century the new canon, and it was various writers picking single books, learning like, it's okay, find what you want, don't treat it as a checklist, find what you like, and think about why you like those books. What about these books speaks to us and makes us wonder, makes us appreciate the world or each other in a new way. Reading this had helped me understand why I had been struck by Blood Meridian, why I was enjoying The Crossing, why I had enjoyed Beloved, why I had enjoyed Ragtime, why I would enjoy Libra or The Known World, the voices from Philip Roth that I would appreciate, and the voices that I would say, like, I don't necessarily want to spend any more time with that person. The sentences from John Updike that worked, and the stories from John Updike that just fell apart. And at the end, the voices in JR and how varied they were, how venal they were, and that this was a language I shared and could share with others. So I love reading, and I hope to hear from everybody. Thank you.